Okay, welcome to the 11th webinar in the New Barn Raising webinar series. Today's webinar is on parks. My name's Gareth Potts. I'm the guy who set up the webinar series and also the wider New Barn Raising program. There is a website, thenewbarnraising.com. It's got a lot of very practical and free, everything on it is free, advice on different ways to raise awareness, raise different resources, money and other resources, and volunteers to help sustain different types of community and civic assets. So I hope you're able to give that a look sometime. The two questions we're really looking at today are how do we sustain parks in a context of public restraint, public spending restraints and public spending cuts, which is the first presentation from the UK. And then the presentation from Ghana that looks at a context where there's not such a great tradition of urban parks and where pressures from urbanization increasingly threaten to encroach upon the parks that there are and also upon the informal spaces, the play spaces that perhaps might otherwise have become the parks of the future. The first speaker is Lydia Ragoonanan, who is the program manager for the Rethinking Parks initiative at Nesta. Nesta is an innovation-focused charity based in London. Lydia has considerable experience working in national level government in strategy and policy roles, both in the UK, but also in her home country of New Zealand. When she was a student at the Victoria University of Wellington, she was awarded the Diplomatic Corps Prize for International Relations. The second speaker is Amowi Phillips of the Mmofra Foundation in Ghana. The foundation itself champions extracurricular, cultural and education programs. Amowi is both a member of the board and also the foundation's international representative, as she's mostly based these days in Washington State in the Northwest United States. She's come up with various initiatives for the foundation over the years, including Playtime in Africa, which is both a concept that champions play and also has a very physical manifestation in a park in Accra, the capital of Ghana, and that will be the main focus of her presentation today. She's also the founder and president of the Friends of Mmofra organization, which is based in Washington State. That looks to undertake work collaboratively on programs with the Mmofra Foundation itself, and it also looks to support the foundation in various ways. Amowi is also a lecturer in African Studies and English Literature at Whitworth University in Spokane in Washington State. And when she was in Ghana, she was a lawyer focusing on child-related activities. So she oversaw the first major collation of child-related laws in Ghana and was responsible for setting up a pioneering legal aid clinic in Ghana. So those are the speakers. I'm going to pass you over now to Lydia in London.
Thanks, Gareth, and hello, everybody. As Gareth mentioned, I work for an innovation foundation called Nesta, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about our Rethinking Parks program. So I'll kind of crack on. So I'll briefly go through why we're doing this particular program and what it's about, where we're at with it to date, because we're we're about 3/4 of the way through our program. I'll give you a snapshot of the ideas being tested, and then finally talk a little bit about some observations and lessons for our program to date. So just to give you context, the Rethinking Parks program is a £1 million fund that aims to test new business models that may sustain the UK's public parks in the face of significant funding cuts. So many of you will think about the UK, as I did before I arrived here, as one of the great innovation, if you like, from the UK is public parks, but actually they're in a period of significant decline. So a couple of years ago, two of our other funding partners, the Heritage Lottery Fund and the Big Lottery Fund, who've invested a lot of money into public parks over the last decade, came to us and asked for us to join with them in this program. So between August last year and December this year, we're supporting 11 teams across the UK to test which of their new ways to raise income or reduce cost have an impact. Okay, so the catalyst for this really is in the UK. There's significant budget cuts that are being faced by local authorities who have traditionally and can kind of continue to be the main source of funding for public parks in the UK. So I've got a quote here from a relatively well-known commentator from another think tank called the New Local Government Network, saying budget cuts on this scale simply cannot be achieved without more radical assessment of the range and scope of council functions. And essentially what we're saying is we're looking at a core government grant, which comes from central government to local authorities, being cut back by 45% over the next few years. And for parks, which aren't a statutory authority, meaning there's no legal requirement to put money into or to keep parks, it means that the proportional difference for parks is massive. So we're looking up to 60–70% funding cuts for parks. So why innovation? Well, the pull really for this program, which focuses on new ways of thinking about funding for parks, is really we think this process of innovation arms people to better face challenges and embrace opportunities. So we think it's a good way to incite new and understand new ways of doing things. So I thought I'd take a brief minute to just touch on what we mean by innovation. And my slide here is really saying it's less about the concept that people have this bright idea, they go away in a laboratory and cook something up themselves, they launch it, their innovation will completely transform the world as we know it, and all of a sudden they're the saviour of the universe. That's not quite what we mean by innovation. Instead, the intent of our program is really to consider and show that innovation in any setting really is more of a process of iteration. So it's really understanding the problem from many different perspectives. It's observing, it's getting different people's perspective on it, it's looking broad for new ideas, and then it's coming up with an idea that you would test, getting feedback as you go, and then at different points of time having to rework that. So this is just, I suppose, showing you what the different kind of approach and what we mean by innovation within the sector is. The other part of our program for parks really too is focusing on experimentation and trying something new and having a system in place to learn from it. So within Nesta, the organisation I work for, we have this kind of consideration of how you might experiment in different ways, and rather than having, if you like, a control group that we're doing with understanding which projects might work and which don't, we're really testing these things out and having a structured approach to understanding what works in terms of both the processes that people are using as well as the impact. And I'll talk a bit about that. So we are, as I mentioned, we are about 2/3 of the way through our program to date. It's looking at 11 models that I'll talk about in a bit that are trying to find new ways to raise income or reduce cost. And what we've done to date is work with our teams to select and test the best ideas. So we had an open call competition across the whole of the UK to say who's got the best idea that might sustain parks in the long term. We had 209 expressions of interest, and we asked 28 of those organisations to come and do a bit more work with us, and of those we selected 11, and at that time we asked them and worked with them on what their business model would be. So this is describing where they will get money or how they will reduce cost, and in thinking about who their target audiences are. So it's really bringing a bit more of a business focus, if you like, to thinking about parks in a way that within a local authority context, parks managers haven't necessarily been required to previously. The other element of what we're doing is bringing in these concepts of how to bring in users and design with and for users in the process. And in launching their programs, we're very interested in observing and measuring impact, and projects kind of launch most of their ideas in early spring. It's very obviously early days, but having systems in place to observe and measure impact and get feedback means that they can change what they're doing as they go. the other key element of our program in terms of working with these teams, so it's a bit like an incubator program or a program of support as well as funds, is that we've got a financial expert working with each of the teams to understand not just the impact that they're having to date and getting under the skin of those numbers, but to forecast for the future, because it's quite a short program in terms of supporting them from a timing perspective, and both the projects themselves as well as the sector as a whole will want to understand, okay, so this new model is just getting up and running, how might it really look in 2, 3, 4, 5 years time? Will it be viable over the long term, or could it be viable? Just like you hear about people setting up a business in another sector, and they say, you know, your first couple of years you might be working your way towards being viable, but not quite there yet. So this information is really important to us. Okay, so I wanted to touch on a few of the ideas that we're testing. I should say that actually within the UK, as I've mentioned, the key source of funding for decades has just been local authority main funding, so it just is kind of given as a non-ring-fenced element to public parks. So some of these ideas are probably known in other contexts, particularly the US, but so that kind of sets the context. So one of these ideas is what we call Burnley Go to the Park. So it's in a northern city within the UK, within England, called Burnley. And what they're doing is testing the impact of lower maintenance planting in the park. So things like turning over wide areas of grass that needs to be mowed, you know, once, twice a fortnight, in peak terms, to meadow planting. And I'm not a horticulturalist, but I understand the debate is out on whether or not this can really save money, and so this is why we were really interested, one of the reasons why we were interested in looking at this program, to actually test whether it does. And what the team have done is, so they've got this kind of wildflower planting. You'll see the picture there is actually the world's first urban bee cage, which isn't quite the right word, but it's essentially something that enables bees to be put into parks so that they can act as pollinators, and it protects the bees from the people and the people from the bees. The genius of it is that bees learn to fly in at head height, so they'll come in towards the top of the frame there, where there's actually bigger holes, big enough for them to fly into and be in their hives. And that is about the whole process of that is not only being there to pollinate these wildflower meadows, but also if you have a critical mass of bees, you can actually have some income from pollination services to local farmers, and also from the honey. So with each of these different elements that they have, they've also got woodland coppicing, which is understanding how to manage woodlands in a low impact way. They have a specialist volunteering roles. So instead of your normal kind of picking up rubbish type of volunteering activity, they'll have learning how to be a wildflower meadow volunteer, understanding how to be a bee volunteer, which is quite an appealing way of doing things. So it's kind of aligned too with this wider ethos for parks management of Burnley, which is really to develop the ecological impact of the park. Okay, so moving on to something completely different now is our the one project that we have in Scotland, which is working at this point across Edinburgh and Glasgow, which are two bigger cities within Scotland. And really this is a place that brings together a crowdfunding opportunity for parks, together with a space that enables residents to find out all about parks information. So previously, and in the UK, it's pretty hard to find a one-to-go to place for information about parks and what kind of facilities they have. So this brings together some information about that. So if you want to pick a park that's got a playground and some toilet facilities in a city, it will show you where it is, it will show you what's on that day, and at the same time it enables friends of groups, which is support groups for parks, to raise funds for them. Okay, so moving on here, I'm just conscious of time. I'm probably going to skip through the next couple of these quickly. Darlington Rethinking Parks is looking to engage businesses in volunteering for parks. It's kind of a well-established idea, I think, in other jurisdictions, but less utilised in the UK. And actually, this is a concept that's really drawing on the fact that there's a lot of corporates in this northern city who have call centres and support centres there. there. So the businesses are really in wanting to have days where teams can have corporate volunteering, can get a sense of team building and so on. So that's that, and that's actually making quite a good impact. There's the Healy Subscription Society. Healy is a small trust park, so it's not maintained by the local authority. It's in Sheffield, which is a city in the middle of the UK, kind of mid to north in Yorkshire, and this is really drawing on the concept that people think about for a museum, where museums are often free, but you can be a member of a museum and pay an amount of money nevertheless if you want to be a member and provide something else. So they offer one-off monthly or annual contributions, and making use of, I think, social media and digital technology to make that really easy. We have the Park Hick project, which is one that's gained quite a lot of international interest for the, I suppose, the aesthetic and the first kind of cap off the rank in terms of the ideas. So this project is really about inviting ideas from the creative business sector. Park Hick is based in an area of London where there's a lot of digital entrepreneurs. It's called the Digital Roundabout, as opposed to, or the Silicon Roundabout as opposed to Silicon Valley. And the thinking really from the team here is that creators want to engage and support parks in a different way than maybe more established corporates. So what they've been doing is asking businesses to come up with their ideas and develop them together. So one of the first manifestations of these ideas is this treehouse or tree office, which you'll see in the picture. It's in a very popular square in part of London that has a lot of creators around there, and they've been testing whether it can be a bookable space for meetings, for shared working and so on. Okay, I think this is the last idea. There's 11 ideas in total, and you can go to the Nesta Rethinking Parks website to look at them all. This is the Bournemouth Parks Foundation, and this is a spin-out from the local authority, and it's really a more traditional, based on actually a model in Seattle that has a Parks Foundation, but really based on the more traditional Parks Foundations that you'll see in the States, and looking at one-off as well as legacy donations from people. The little quirk that they have is they're trying to test the use of real-time digital giving. Many of you will be aware of things like Apple Pay and other payment systems are just on the cusp of coming out or have come out, and so the team is trying to understand how they can use these payment systems, or as they call it, at the time of the emotional intensity. So when you're in a park, you've felt something, seen something exciting, you've seen a band play, you've had a, you can give at that time of an ask. So that's one of the things we're supporting them to do. I'll just skip through some of these because I'm conscious of time, and we can look at observations and lessons to date. As I say, it's not the end of the program yet. So one of the first things is really reflecting on some of the call-outs, I suppose, from other local authorities in the UK that have been asking us, what's the one answer? And, we obviously live in a complex world, and it's interesting that people are often looking, and given the size of the cuts that we have, for very easy to describe and easy to implement answers, but unfortunately there is no elegant answer. And I think Gareth's work in the report he did on the new barn raising really highlighted the fact that there's a range of models that you need and a range of sources of funding. But from our program we've learned that we do have some good places to start. So this is more general insights from our program to date rather than an input into this is the one model that's going to work, because as I mentioned, our financial forecasting is still being done. So one of the things is that in the parks in the UK haven't really got an absolutely amazing handle on their finances. So one of the things that we've been working with them to do is really understand where they are now in terms of finances. Of course, that can reveal some things in terms of quite obvious cost savings, but also opportunities for maybe where you can think about things slightly differently, but also it helps you benchmark whether you're making a difference or not. We advocate and have been saying the same for people who use the parks, really getting to understand what people love about them, what they'd like to see more of, how they relate to their daily lives and what benefit they offer, how the interface, I suppose, between what people do in parks and then, for example, the digital world or other things that they're interested in might come in, and that can reveal some quite interesting answers. The third point here is really based on many of our team's perspectives, is having a mandate to operate. So any new project that you embark on, it's really important to make sure that you've got your key partners lined up. One of the things I didn't mention with all of our programs is most of them are a partnership between both a municipal local authority or a city and a charitable trust or a different partner. And in some of the cases, things are perhaps, there's been friction, if you like, when the ability to progress a project has been bottlenecked by either a misunderstanding by one of the partners or because there hasn't really been that senior enough buy-in from the get-go to deliver something. So having that really clear mandate to operate, particularly when you're doing something that is less known or not necessarily identified as best practice yet, I couldn't emphasize that more. The other element, and for those of you that are familiar with Gareth's work already on the new barn raising, is that really layer your income. So this is really about understanding that you need many different pots of money and many different sources of income or cost savings, if you like, to make parks or other civic assets really come alive. So it could be that you get an element of grant funding, you get an element from concessions, you think about in some ways how parks can be solutions to other problems. So the example that I skipped through earlier was Park Work, which is a project in Bristol that's seeking, again, and they do these things in the States, to use people who are perhaps have lowest skills or have learning disabilities to gain confidence, work experience and skills from the horticultural sector, whilst at the same time that provides additional benefit for parks that would otherwise be left unmaintained. So, think of at everything that you do, how can you get income? Or how can you reduce costs? We don't even see in the UK that local authority funding will continue to be a key element of funding for parks, but we really have to find others, and just a foundation or just as I say, something like the Park Work Initiative, you've got to do all of those things together. Again, make use of partnerships. I've got this as a Lego kind of picture from Lord of the Rings, so part of that is a nod to the films from my home country, but the real point there is that actually if you think about the Fellowship of the Rings, for those of you that are familiar with the story, it's about a range of people with different skill sets who you wouldn't normally bring together coming together, and the point is they're all there around a common purpose and they can bring different skills to the party. They can open up a different set of networks that you wouldn't normally be able to draw on. So I would, if you're just a local authority, if you're just a charity, maybe think about who else you can work with, what skills you can draw in, what perspectives even that they can bring that are perhaps different to the norm in your own organisation. And actually, just going back to this too, think about who else in your organisation can help. So sometimes some of our projects have really gone well. For example, the Park Hack project, where they've teamed up with their business development team within the borough, rather than just feeling it's just parks alone. There's a flip side to partnerships, and I mentioned the need to kind of all be on the same page. So I'd say at the beginning, and as you go through any kind of relationship or partnership with people, to take time to understand the needs and expectation of those partners, and don't underestimate the power of formalizing those in some ways. So some of our projects that have, again, I suppose, had bottlenecks or come awry have been those that have maybe had a gentleman's agreement, for want of a better word, about how you might proceed. It hasn't been written down, and actually that's meant there's been confusion or misunderstandings further on and led to delays or things not progressing as intended. So I think even something like a memorandum of understanding can be quite a good way to help ensure you're all working towards the same goal. and also understanding what their value, if you like, getting out from it too. So for example, for our park hack businesses, they might be looking for a different set of expectations and needs, a feeling of needing to give something back, wanting to develop connections with other businesses in the area, as opposed to the Darlington project we had that's also working with businesses, but for them their needs is really about giving staff an opportunity to do something different with their day. It's about that well-being elements that reduce sick leave, having a more so it's a different strokes for different folks. So this slide is really about, and hopefully it applies to other jurisdictions, not just the UK, is about when you're thinking about working with people or who might help, in the case of the UK, help support an asset like a park where you don't, a local authority for example, can't do it on their own anymore, is to say look beyond the usual suspects. So within the UK there's a very strong and good network of friends of groups who look after parks. They can advocate for parks, raise money for them, and the variety and number of them is very different across the UK. And there's a tendency, or I've heard a tendency for many organisations to think that when the pinch comes we can just get friends of groups to pick up the slack, if you like, in maintaining parks, whereas actually a lot of those groups are very good at what they do but not necessarily best placed to have the resources, skills or even appetite to take on board those things. But nevertheless, it doesn't mean that there's other partners that aren't interested. For example, I've mentioned the appetite of businesses or appetite of other green space charitable organisations that are happy to coordinate volunteers and really draw on that aspect. Okay, so the other element too is I mentioned that what we're doing in Rethinking Parks is taking those ideas that haven't really been tested. But if this is the point about testing and testing again. So if you're trying something new in your area, whether it's big or small, just be prepared to and have the time and willingness to know that if it doesn't work the first time, have a system built in place to learn from that, know how you're getting feedback, understand that in real time, and then change it and test it again. Having, as Gareth mentioned, I've worked in central and local government, and within those contexts sometimes there's a tendency to just want to go out and say let's do a pilot, and with the anticipation it's going to be rolled out. Having the freedom to operate and the mandate to say we don't think this is going to work the first time, so let's do it in a small controlled environment and get it right, is actually a really valuable thing. Okay, on to the last couple of slides now. So again, what we're doing is working with people who are really, I suppose, early innovators. So one of the things I haven't quite emphasised is that we're working with only such a small number of programs because we want them to be able to show to the rest of the sector what works and what doesn't, and to be able to learn from that. And part of that in doing anything new is you really need to have a belief in your idea, but at the same time have the, I suppose, maturity or the openness to change. So some of the projects or some people sometimes are so stuck on their idea that it's the best in the world that it's a shame, because you have to be open to change and iteration as you test something, put your idea out into the world and see how it flies. My final point really about lessons to date and is really be prepared for the long haul. So any change program, as many of you probably know, really takes a long time. So our projects have been at this from application stage through to now for like 2 years now, and or not quite 2 years, 18 months, 20 months, and they're only just getting started. And the effort, the time, the blood, sweat and tears, if you like, you have to put aside for any change is a long-term thing. And I'd say even if you're replicating something else, is just make sure that you're prepared for the long haul to see the benefit of any impact. It doesn't mean it's not worthwhile, it completely will be, but yeah, it takes time. So give yourself a couple of years, and if you're working with people to be decision makers and support your ideas, I'd advocate to try and build that time in and make sure that you've managed expectations in that way. Okay, so I mentioned we're kind of not quite finished with our program yet, but hopefully many have whetted your appetite to know more. So from our program, from February next year, we'll be sharing with the sector the blueprints of the successful models, so more detail obviously about what they did, what impact they made and what worked, participants' advice and learning. So all of our 11 teams have been engaged in doing learning reflection logs throughout the program. We're working with them now to give more broader overviews on what's worked and what hasn't, and what their advice for others doing similar things would be. Obviously, the evidence of impact and the financial forecast is key, not just for the teams we're working with, but for others who think, oh, that idea looks good for my organisation, maybe I can see whether the business model would work. And finally, the other element is some tools to support adoption. So in this, to date, I've been talking about things like prototyping, talking about things about how to engage users. Well, we've worked with our participants as a cohort to share with them these skills, and we will be, if you like, helping to shape those tools so that others in the sector can use them from February next year as well. So that's it from me.
Great. Thanks very much, Lydia. There's a range of really interesting, innovative ideas there that hopefully this kind of approach will outlive the spending cuts that you mentioned. Okay, let's pass over now to Amowi, who's in Spokane, Washington, but she's going to be talking about her work in Accra, Ghana. Amowi, over to you.
Hello, Lydia. Thank you, Garrett. Playtime in Africa is an initiative to champion both play and cultural space for children, particularly in Ghana's cities, but also in collaboration with other actors around urban Africa. Because this is at the moment quite a small group of practitioners, we do pay close attention to any global models that we can learn from, such as Nesta's work that Lydia has just been talking about. More children than ever are growing up in the rapidly expanding and youthful cities in Africa. However, if Ghana's capital Accra is anything to go by, there are few urban public spaces that are being designed with the needs of children 15 years and younger in mind, and these constitute about 40% of the urban population. So a team of which I'm part, which is beginning to address this, is Mmofra Foundation. Playtime in Africa comes under the umbrella of this civic organization in Ghana, which has served children through literacy and cultural enrichment programs, as Garrett said, since 1997. In May this year, I took part in a 3-week conversation moderated by MIT's CoLab Radio in their urban planning department with the founding members of 2 other groups, Imagination Africa Children's Museum in Dakar, Senegal, and Play Africa Children's Museum in Johannesburg, South Africa. So although we are thousands of miles apart, there are encouraging signs of early networking in these countries and in a number of others. So I will explain the inspiration for the Playtime in Africa concept and give a little bit of the history of children's parks in Ghana. And then I will share with you our park development experience over the last 3 years and how we hope to keep up the work. Playtime in Africa is inspired by a 1960s photo essay of the same name, which was accompanied by descriptions of rich play environments of children in Ghana at the time. Over 50 years on, the book is now out of print, of course, but it was very much ahead of its time in connecting imaginative play both in and out of doors to children's personal and social development, as well as the kind of creative problem solving which we recognize today as critical cognitive skills to instill in children. One of the authors of the book, Ifwa Sutherland, founded the civic organization Mmofra Foundation. I'm proud to say she was my mother, but she was also the person in Ghana who set up the National Children's Park System there, which had its heyday in the 1980s and in the early 1990s. During that period, the National Commission on Children had stewardship over children's park and library complexes in at least two of Ghana's major cities, Accra and Kumasi. And it also had models at the level of smaller communities. So the 10 to 12 acre Ifwa Sutherland Children's Park in central Accra is one of these spaces. Had that trajectory continued, Ghana, of course, would very likely have established an admirable record for child-centered urban and rural civic spaces. But by the 2000s, these important assets had deteriorated into outright places of danger for children, or at best as uninspiring and inadequately maintained facilities. So here are quotes from articles in the press, which speak of the children's park as, an eyesore, a refuse dump, abandoned, overtaken for other uses, and so forth. The Ifwa Sutherland Park, for example, is very underutilized, and it's constantly vulnerable to being overtaken for building development. And yet it's potentially a huge economic and social and cultural asset for the city of Accra. So one of the roles that Mmofra Foundation has played has been to hold the government departments and the municipal authorities' feet to the fire periodically, about these matters, and to generate some public discussion as well. So, for example, last year we hosted a very informative Twitter chat to gauge public interest, and public interest is definitely quite high. The reason for this state of affairs are obviously quite complex. In 2012, our organization started a public conversation in Accra on urban space and also on play culture and childhood development. So it was quite a pioneering effort in an effort to understand what barriers stand in the way of open access to the benefits of play and nature and inspiring environments for the children who will, after all, be the urban citizens of the future. We asked them for an honest and very critical look at land use priorities. So for example, how does the design of a city encourage or discourage playfulness? Are children safe outside? What factors undermine the enforcement of urban planning regulations? In what ways are our cities failing our children? My understanding from other practitioners is that these would be relevant questions in many cities in this part of the world. So the informal playgrounds that children in the city create for themselves. As you can see, the streets and roadsides, markets and culverts and ditches and neighborhood byways. We coined the term bear parks, for these spaces that children will find and play football or soccer in. But the scenes you see here of children making their own opportunities for outdoor urban play would be a familiar sight in much of urban Africa, certainly much more so than the structured commercial play spaces of the kind that is also shown in the upper left part of the picture there, though I think that there are some of those as well. I always say that I think we've already mastered the adventure playground, but in a positive sense, these do provide opportunities of independent, self-directed play, but they also have to be balanced against real environmental dangers like pedestrian accidents and falls, burns, drowning, toxic exposure, and the like. So parents and educators and activists and concerned residents have all strongly expressed their frustration with the lack of properly functioning children's parks. And by that, I mean publicly accessible, maintained, thoughtfully designed, or even intentionally positioned open spaces. So this is the environment in which we at Mmofra Foundation made a commitment some 3 years ago to exercise a license we had been granted over a private 2-acre site in one of Accra's principal neighborhoods called Jowulu, with a mandate to create the best model we could possibly envision of a children's park. Fortunately, the site already has a number of mature trees, as you can see, so we have a bit of a head start there. We call the site Mmofra Place, and I will use that name now. Mmofra, as we saw earlier, means children. Part of the Mmofra Place site and its adjacent environments are impacted by severe flooding during the rainy season, which is particularly dangerous for small children. The groundwater in the area is brackish, and mosquitoes are a serious environmental hazard which limit the hours of use of the park. However, its placement in a mixed income, mixed use neighborhood served by many schools is actually quite ideal. Up until 2013, the site had no infrastructure to speak of and no municipal sources of funding to support the kind of phased and comprehensive design building schedule that we needed to realize the vision for Mmofra Place. So one of our first acts was just to physically occupy the space just as it was, and to begin to hold monthly programming for children under the trees as a sort of an outdoor children's museum, if you like. But it very quickly became clear that toilet facilities and water and power were essential prerequisites. So with the need to resolve that came the idea that in solving these problems of site infrastructure, we actually had the opportunity to address in microcosm some of the really critical problems and needs of the city, principally sanitation, access to clean water and power, fresh food production, and mediation of environmental degradation. In the last year or so, there have been power cuts and brownouts in Accra quite consistently. So the exciting thing here was that by putting children at the center of the design of these elements, we could combine utility and function and form and education through exploration and discovery all at the same time. I know that the implications of this approach are definitely ambitious, but we think that they're achievable. So many intersecting outcomes can come together in a children's park setting like Mmofra Place: public health, sustainable use of water and materials, floodwater management, innovative approaches to literacy, equity for girls, youth leadership, nutrition information, environmental awareness, creative problem solving, confidence building. So if there's a place where urban children can be made aware of their city's ecosystem in a playful way, then I do think that you're developing a future resident who is cued in and receptive to improving the urban quality of life. Today, the park does have some basic infrastructure in the form of an 80-meter borehole for clean groundwater, which is independent of the municipal water system. It's got a set of low water use composting toilets. It's got some off-grid solar power and a starter aquaponics system. These were laid in with a grant from 2 diplomatic missions to Ghana so that the park could host a 3-month climate education exhibit for over 2,000 children in 2014 and 2015. With that event, the park is gaining a reputation as a pioneering natural learning environment and a site for outdoor hands-on discovery, and a place where a variety of other education innovations are taking place. The site is open to children of all backgrounds on a regular basis, monthly, but we're working towards increased public access when we have the resources to do so. There are about 60 to 100 schools in the general area who know about the park. The potential number of young visitors are in the zones closest to the park and number about 20,000. But this number, of course, increases when children are transported in from further out, obviously. Children from higher income urban households, of course, may be as deprived of open or green space as their lower income peers. So this gives parents and caregivers across the socioeconomic spectrum a common cause. Most of the children come from families that might be described as the urban poor to lower middle class. But this is probably the only type of public space where we have an outside of school opportunity for children from many different kinds of households to interact. So, needless to say, something like hand washing becomes an extremely important thing in this intentionally, hands-on environment within a city that still suffers from waterborne diseases. This picture is of a simple and very effective tippy tap, which is made from salvaged wood off the site and recycled plastic jugs. So it's one of the sanitation interventions that we're able to make and test and share with other sites, particularly schools. The percentage of low-income households with access to children's books for leisure reading is extremely low, about 1%. So both the foundation and the park itself have a very strong literary focus. We make an effort to incorporate the written word into the landscape in playful ways and to facilitate visual storytelling in as many ways as we possibly can. So because classroom-based learning is still quite rigid in Ghana, we find that children who have quite a lot of anxiety about reading textbooks within that formal environment respond very positively to this kind of invitational approach here. So now to the all-important business of how we've managed to get this far. First of all, there are thousands of volunteer hours that are shoring up the whole enterprise, and it looks like this will continue to be the case. I have mentioned that we've relied greatly on local and international pro bono professional services in areas like architecture, in drafting, engineering, horticulture, art, and so forth. But we found that institutional academic partnerships have always also helped us quite a lot to gain momentum. Typically, it takes about one academic year cycle to set these up. But with carefully chosen partnerships, it can be well worth the effort, particularly since Mmofra Place provides a rare opportunity in Africa to investigate the impact of outdoor learning on educational outcomes. Ghanaian architecture students, for example, were facilitators for our original design workshop. We invited graduate students from the University of Ghana to conduct research on recreational culture with families in our communities. We also hosted two teams of master's level design students from the Technical University of Delft who designed and built the original play structures. In 2014, we had design students from North Carolina State University in the United States as well, who took a study abroad credit course, which involved a week of community service design work, for which they've actually just won an honor award from the American Society of Landscape Architects. And as well, we've had graduate students from the Gambia in West Africa partner with us to conceptualize and deliver an outdoor exhibition for over 2,000 school children. One of the beneficial outcomes of working with academic programs, of course, is that we're able to carry concepts through research to design, building, and testing. And we also gain professional documentation like project-specific infographics, which serve us very well with reports and potential funders. So the example we have here of students from the Technical University of Delft working with our team to prototype a completely original play structure is exactly the kind of work that we're producing at the park. Every element is designed with the local child in mind, and it's site tested. And we, of course, keep the design plans so that the structures can be recreated and shared. Local funding support has been more of a challenge, perhaps partly because the lack of public awareness of the importance of play and healthy outdoor environments translates to low value accorded to public spaces like parks and playgrounds. Our approach with local businesses is to urge them to take a much more imaginative and broader view of their CSR or corporate social responsibility goals. And we're beginning to make some headway with our ideas for rethinking the functions of a park and the clear evidence that open green space is becoming scarce in Accra. So I'll just move on to say that the design implications of the multiple use park that we have is that there must be a nimble footprint which enables us to have maximum flexibility. It also means that a great deal of forward thinking has to go into culturally inspired aesthetics, along with form and function, because we want the site to reflect as much of Ghanaian art and African artistic inspirations and literary traditions, so that we can become a destination for visitors and residents alike. So in this regard, we've had incredible support from the arts community of creatives in the city. I mention here particularly the Foundation for Contemporary Art, whose directors actually curated the Park Science exhibition. So quickly, a few words about the shared park, which is a concept which recognizes the scarcity of green space and makes ideas and prototypes available to anyone in the community who wants to reproduce them. So our team includes concept shapers, community artists, gardeners, consultants, artisans, and others who design and build and test programs specifically for our environment. So this principle applies to very simple and effective ideas like the paddles in that previous slide, which are actually cooking utensils sold and used by women in the local markets. So just to round up, I would say that the most effective and efficient paths to standing up and sustaining a project of this nature are to use multiple and simultaneous strategies. So we found that we need to combine the thousands of volunteer hours that keep the project alive with a serious and substantial set of sustained partnerships, both local and global. We'd like to talk to businesses and social enterprises interested in showcasing their products by making the park a demonstration site, for example, or a focus of professional volunteering by their employees. So with that kind of a solid base, community and individual support come into play and then give the project the vitality it needs to thrive. In my conversations with museum and park practitioners in Africa, we're seriously discussing ways to come together as a continent of wide alliances and international groups to hopefully strengthen our position in seeking development support. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions.
I'm just looking at a question, just looking through the questions that are coming in. Just one for Lydia here. Is there any evidence of ideas being taken up by other cities, including the 11 participating cities? So any examples of people coming to you to take up these ideas, or sharing of ideas between the partner organisations, Lydia?
Yeah. Hi, Gareth. So we've had massive demand within the UK of people to understand, they want information now, and in particular, so we've had a lot of people saying what works, and I would say on the top of my head, probably 10 to 12 local authorities coming and saying what ones would you recommend at this point. We've had specific interest directly in replicating the ideas in relation to the Parks Foundation, so the Bournemouth model, and also one of the models that I didn't mention in the presentation, which is looking at a parks-focused business improvement district, which is where businesses pay a levy over a 5-year period towards improvements in the space. And that's an idea that I know one of a local authority in particular is very keen on. So we're almost holding people back from saying this is the ideas that you should be taking up, because we need better evidence of impact. But there's so ideas haven't necessarily been replicated to date, but I know of at least 2 local authorities that are developing plans to replicate 2 of the ideas that we're testing.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And a question for Amowi. Is there current political backing? You mentioned the history of the parks. Is there current political backing for parks in Accra or Ghana, Amowi?
Well, it's interesting. There hasn't been for a long time, but interestingly, the Ghana government this year has made a very powerful statement, probably the clearest statement since the 1980s, about the value of parks and green cities. So we're very encouraged by that. The president has actually specifically mentioned, the National Children's Park and said that, categorically that it's not for sale. People who are making moves to buy the land should back off, and that he's entertaining proposals for the revamping of the park. So we're pretty hopeful about that. It seems like we're in a new era of park creation. In the second city of Ghana, in Kumasi, they've just opened a brand new public park there as well.
Wonderful, great. And I suppose another question related to that, really, is there actually a parks department in Accra City Council, or dealing with the parks in Accra, the ones?
It does, but it deals with the kind of formal public spaces in roundabouts and, the cultural monuments and so forth. So even though they have been in the past involved in the children's park, it's no longer quite the case. But we do find that if we go there and ask them for horticultural advice, they're prepared to give it.
Okay, thank you. And a question from someone in Barcelona here for Lydia. Is it possible to have an overview of the 209 submissions or the 28 pre-selected participants? If so, how? So I guess all the ideas that came in, right?
Yeah. Well, I did actually do a blog when we talked about the applications that we approved, if you like, that the people that were funded. So that talks about the characteristics of most of the ideas. So in the most part, many of the local authorities that applied for the fund were looking at things like a park cafe or something that was known to us. So we had 4 criteria for assessing the projects, and one of them was about the level of innovation in relation to new income sources. So we've got statistics on it, but the best thing to do is I can probably, I don't quite know how, but if you go to the nesta.org.uk and then the Rethinking Parks page has on it an overview of the submissions, and that gives a kind of an overview on what the characteristics of the best submissions were. So maybe Klaus can follow me on Twitter or something, and I can send them something directly. Okay. So, okay. But all 209. A lot of the organisations kind of knew the thing. Oh, there we go. Will do. Good. I'm pleased.
Okay, and that relates to another question, I suppose, around the Rethinking Parks. Is can you say a bit about where all of these ideas came from and or were selected? So I noticed you had that post-it slide. I mean, is there anything about the process of generating ideas that you learnt about when you were doing it?
Yes, yep. So a couple of things. One is we're very aware that, I think I mentioned, in the park sector they haven't really had to draw in the UK. There's been this one steady source of income for decades, and so one of the things we were really keen to do is try and get a new range of partnerships coming to the fore to submit their ideas. I'd say that we've kind of accomplished that with our program, and the approach that we took to that was 2 things. One is we wanted to whet the appetite of people to test new things. So we had a report that we published in November 2013 that talked about different models of funding parks from the UK and elsewhere. That was, I suppose, intended to kind of stimulate some conversation. And then we actually ran a series of webinars, but mostly did a roadshow around the UK where people learnt about the fund, but also we got them to do some exercises around thinking about processes and practices around generating new ideas. And if you're interested in some tools around that, again, on the Nesta website there's a section that says develop your skills, and I can also recommend something called the DIYtoolkit.org, which is a set of tools for anybody that's wanting to set up a different kind of social enterprise or do something differently, and on that there's some kind of tools that you can use. So they were the 2 kind of impact things that we did to try and get people to generate new ideas. as I say, it was kind of successful. I think if we did this again, we'd probably go more directly out to a broader number of sectors. But we did have a good range of academia, charities, local authorities, social enterprises, and so on getting involved. So that was really good. Yeah, hopefully, does that answer your question, Gareth?
It does. Yep. No, that's great. Thank you. Another question, couple of related questions here for Amowi. One's quite straightforward, I suppose. Is would you welcome donations of children's books? Let's just deal with that question first, Amowi. Can people send you children's books or?
Yes, people can, and actually, we have social media pages with the very specific kinds of books that we're looking for. We want the children to have a very good sense of themselves, as well as of excellent literature from other places. So we're quite specific, and we can point people to, our Pinterest page, for example, where we maintain curated lists of the sorts of books that we have. So absolutely, yes.
Correct. And then the second part of the question really was about the volunteer skills you most need. And I know you touched on the enormous number of contributions you've had. And what are the three types of place or types of skill that you would most need?
I'd say that we actually need fantastic artists, because the environmental art aspect of this is really important to us. There's a wonderful man called Theaster Gates, who's an artist in America, who says that beauty is a basic service, and we really believe in that. We're also looking for retired people, for example, who have expertise in woodwork or building or gardening, that sort of thing. But I think the most important one probably would be people who can help us to work out our systems, our programming and staffing systems, because this is a new culture for us. And so both in terms of the people who work in the park and the users of it, we really have to do our best to establish a good system from the get-go.
Okay, and then just a final question. I can't see any more questions coming in. The final question again for Amowi is who staffs the park's activities? Is it open for select hours?
In our park, it's directly related to resources. So we open 2 or 3 times a month for children who can come and not pay at all. And then we have, people who want to come and book the park for activities. So we have a small skeleton staff, but we definitely need to have a full-time programmer.
Okay, listen, I'm just conscious of the time now. We've gone over the hour. I just want to thank both of our presenters, Lydia Ragoonanan from Nesta in London and Amowi Phillips from the Mmofra Foundation based in Accra, Ghana. Thank you to you for participating.